She found the eviction notice tucked beneath a stack of white handkerchiefs, the paper folded as if it too were part of the mourning linens. The dress she had buried her mother in still clung at the shoulders, a midnight blue silk that had not yet given up its scent of lilies and damp earth. Immani held the notice with one gloved hand, the other steadying the hem as if the fabric might tell her what to do. Outside, people moved in a slow sympathy. Churchwomen arranging extra plates of sweet potato pie, a cousin rehearsing the same phrase of condolence, a son clipping at his tie as if his discomfort could be smoothed like a crease. The words on the page were small and ordinary. They did not match the absurdity of her life in that moment. The thin, bureaucratic letter with its polite dates and soft imperatives, demanding that she and whoever else dwelled at the address clear out by a certain afternoon. It was the kind of paper people shoveled into drawers along with birth certificates and receipts, the kind of paper you expected when you had been careless or unlucky. She was neither. She folded the notice back into its place and slid it beneath the handkerchiefs. Her fingers brushed the corner of Celestine's leather journal, a warm, worn thing with pages darkened by thumb oil. She had brought it with her to the church hall because she always did. A small reliquary of lessons, a map of thrift and stubbornness, a paper trail that read like scripture to her. Someone would notice the journal and make some polite remark about family, about what duty meant when a mother died. No one would notice the ledger she had kept in a different notebook, the accountings of quiet transfers and intentional separations of risk and possession. No one, not even the people who thought they knew her husband, saw the arithmetic of her life. In the receiving line, Gloria, her mother-in-law, took Immani's hand and held it like someone testing the grain of a fabric. There was an appraisal in the way Gloria's eyes slid from Immani's face to the dress and back, the old calculations of class and worth. "You look respectable," Gloria said, and beneath the brittle kindness lay the assumption that Immani's respectability was fragile, that it depended on the house's roof and on a husband who could speak loudly enough to drown out any rumors. Denise, a cousin with perfect teeth and sharper opinions, moved in to suggest that perhaps new arrangements would be wise. She glanced, as others did, at Kwame with the automatic deference people afford the man who speaks about work. Kwame drifted through the hall like a man floating above his own life. His hands were soft from an office job. His voice was practiced in sympathy. He leaned toward women in the pews and allowed them to straighten their narratives around him. He spoke in the language of provision. "We'll see to it. My family. I'm arranging," as if naming a thing made it so. When at the punch bowl someone asked after the finer debts, he offered a half smile and a phrase that hung in the air. "We'll handle it." It was not a boast. It was a story he had learned to tell himself and others. Provider, protector, the one who managed the public ledger of the family. Behind that phrase, a different ledger existed and had been there for years. Immani had been taught to keep books the way her mother had been taught to mend hems. Always measure twice, stitch once, hide the tuck so the garment could bear the strain. Celestine had marked pages of her journal with a fountain pen habit of underlining the same sentence in different ways. Patience builds power. Patience builds power. Patience. She wrote it thick enough to be felt with a fingertip. Immani felt it now. An inheritance that did not glitter but that accrued like interest. At the center table, on a chipped dish perfumed by the warm caramel of burnt sugar, people took turns telling the story of Celestine in carefully arranged clauses. The church mothers traded memories, the seamstress who patched parish clothes, who hemmed the choir robes without complaint, who could make 2 yards of fabric look like a blessing. Someone cited a scripture, not as sermon but as eulogy, the steady hand that works unseen. Immani listened and folded napkins until her palms remembered the rhythm of work. Her face was a composed plane. Grief did not leak like water from it, but the sorrow lived in her posture, the slight tilt that always showed she was listening to something beneath the spoken words. Out beyond the windows, the parish parking lot was an informal stage for a different life. Neighbors gathered in small knots, phones flashing like guilty insects. Somewhere, a woman posted a photograph of herself with Kwame, polished, smiling, with a caption that read like permission. The post went on, as posts do, to gather affirmation. A friend tagged a heart. A cousin hit like. Tiffany's smile was a practiced thing, a public face arranged to look like affection and forward momentum. Her image circulated with the same lightness as a photograph of the caterer's tray. It took on the weight of an anecdote. There is the new friend, the new joy, the new chapter. For the people who skimmed storylines rather than books, chapter headings were enough. No one connected the photograph to the woman who had quietly set aside money from obscure consulting contracts, who had registered a name at the state registry that was, to all appearances, a different enterprise, and yet the seed of what would become far greater. No one saw the minutes she kept in careful handwriting of meetings that never required a conference room and a suit, board calls made at midnight, a line item recorded as research, a transfer described in a ledger under a code name that only she understood. They did not know the scale of what she had been building, or the vocabulary she used in the dark hours that matched the rhythm of her mother's stitches. It would have seemed fantastical to them to hear that the quiet firm she had shepherded for a decade would come to be worth $100,000. It was a number she did not say aloud in the church hall. Some truths wait for the right stage. When the repast thinned and neighbors drifted away with paper cups and condolences, someone offered to drive Immani home, but she refused. On the walk back, she held her clutch close, the weight of the leather journal at her hip like a compass. The house smelled of stale coffee and the residue of conversation, cup rings on the table like small pale moons. The eviction notice lay in the drawer where she had slid it. She had placed it there because she did not want its edges to cut into the fragile goods on the hall table. Now she set it on top and called Adis. Adis arrived with a casserole and an armful of practical silence. She was the kind of friend who understood that the right thing to bring to a woman in grief was a casserole and a willingness to be ordinary alongside her. She took in the room with a quick appraisal, newspaper open at the op-ed, a stack of papers on the bureau, the muted television, and then sat down opposite Immani without speaking. The two women had known each other since the days of university class registrations, when Immani insisted on an extra class in accounting for my own curiosity, and Adis drifted into philosophy because she liked the rhythm of ideas. Together they had been a modest conspiracy of different kinds of discipline and charm. Adis watched Immani hold the eviction notice and did not gasp. She only said quietly, "They'll say a lot of things today." "They already have," Immani replied. Her voice was low enough that it kept the room between them. "Gloria thinks it's about appearances. Denise thinks it's about choices. The cousins are already aligning themselves with the man who speaks loudest." Adis put the casserole on the counter and, as Adis did, opened the lid just enough to let the scent of the sweet potatoes breathe into the kitchen. "What they don't know is heavier than what they say," she said. "But you know how to keep things steady." There was no insistence in her tone, only a trusted fact. Adis had seen the way Immani kept ledgers like small prayers. She had seen the way the woman stitched her life into places people seldom sought to look. Immani thought of Celestine's hands. In one memory, the seamstress's fingers were raw from a week of mending, staining leather and thread alike, but her posture was upright. Celestine had taught her to thread a needle with the breath lightly held, and to finish a seam by walking the length of it 3 times with the iron. "Make the work invisible," she would say. "So when you step back, the thing does not need you." That phrase had been, for years, a secret prayer against the world's hunger for spectacle. She poured a cup of tea and sat while Adis adjusted the casserole dish to get the perfect crust. For a while they sat with the quotidian sounds of a house that was not yet a battleground. A neighbor's radio muffled through walls, the small clink of spoons in a sink. Later, after Adis had left with the empty dish and a promise to return, Immani opened Celestine's journal. The lines of ink were an inventory of continuing lessons, measures of thrift, the names of people who owed favors, a notation about a loan, a line of scripture that had become a household guide. There was always a margin where Celestine had written, in smaller hand, what could not be taught. Look for the seam that hides the strength. Immani made a small list of her own. It was not long, names, dates, a note about an account, a reminder to call Robert Langley. She placed the list on top of the journal and slid both into the drawer where the eviction notice lay. It felt strange to place them together. One was a threat, the other was a map. That night she lay awake in the bed they had shared. The mattress, a folded history of small adjustments and old arguments, softened into habit. Quame slept on the other side, his breathing regular. Sometimes he spoke in his sleep of work numbers and of plans that sounded like his. Promotion, new office, words that fit him like comfortable shoes. Once, in a room that had once been full of shared plans, he reached across and took her hand, and she let the touch be small and neutral as a button. She did not wake him when the phone clicked a soft reminder. She sat in the dark and went through the ledgers of her mind like prayer beads. The next morning the neighborhood woke with gossip. A social photograph had begun to do the work gossip does, flattening nuance into headlines. In one careful image, Tiffany leaned against Quame with a laugh that was the kind of thing designed to be shared. The caption beneath it, sharp, breezy, was full of the performative intimacy of a new claim. Someone forwarded it to Denise, who forwarded it to Gloria, who took the photograph like a thread and began to unravel commentary into a long, thin braid of certainty. "He's moved on," someone declared over the phone with a mixture of judgment and relief. "She deserves better," said another, applying a moral polish to a public image. The town did not know, could not see, the work Immani carried in another form. A small company she had begun in a spare bedroom, then had moved into the back of a friend's studio, then into an office with no name on the door. It was a modest-sounding entity that advised, pooled, and reinvested. In legal language, it was a collection of holding arrangements and boards that met more often than her social calendar allowed. For years she had introduced the company as something in development, because public announcements were a bad fit for the patient mind. Behind the veneer of modesty, she had cultivated relationships and talent. She had taken small contracts that became durable revenue streams. She had sat on calls at midnight with foreign teams and learned how to speak in the tidy language of governance without losing the urgency of purpose. To every person who assumed a single image of her life, that of the grieving wife at the church hall, there was another ledger that proved otherwise. The truth of those careful years would one day be more visible than the pictures now cued on a phone. But this was not the time for spectacle. When the eviction notice finally had to be addressed, the manner of it carried its own small humiliation. There were rumors. The house was in his name. The mortgage had been adjusted. The signed papers had the flourish of someone who had decided the story. But the facts of family law and ownership are not as simple as gossip. They braid ownership into records, into the quiet centering of counsel and filings. Immani read the notice twice just to let the letters anchor into her bones and made no scene. Her hands were steady as when she mended a tear in a sleeve. She took down the handkerchief she had kept for Celestine's funeral and folded them into neat piles. For 1 hour she washed the dishes and listened to the sound of ceramic against the basin like a metronome, separating the time she had been allowed from the time she would claim for herself. Someone might have expected fury. They would have had in return a look from Immani that was neither blank nor enraged. It was the look of a woman cataloging what belonged to her and what did not, of someone who recognized that possession could be a public story and that ownership could be a private ledger. The world loved drama, she preferred balance sheets. That afternoon she sat for a long time with Celestine's journal on the table. The seamstress's notes were patient. Small investments in a mother's name, a list of people who had agreed to help in emergencies, the price of a bolt of cloth noted in the margin like a prayer. Celestine had been in life a woman who understood that security was stitched together, a scrap saved here, a favor repaid there, an account opened under a cousin's name to keep a loan safe. She had taught her daughter to place value where it could grow unseen. Immani made a decision then. It was not sudden. It had been the end product of years, as a garment is the end product of seamstress work. She called Robert Langley. She did not call because the eviction notice demanded a response so much as because the notice had erected a visible hinge she had been waiting to open. Robert's name was in Celestine's journal, not as a conspirator but as a steward of forms, the kind of lawyer who respected patterns and would not be tempted by theatrics. He had been the person who had read contracts aloud at midnight and who had once said to her with a professional detachment she had learned to trust, I set things to be firm enough to withstand foolishness. On the other end of the line, his voice was the exact sort of gravel you expect from someone who has sat in many rooms. "I've been reading your last memo," he said, and there was no surprise in his tone, only method. "You've done good work." She answered with the kind of small acknowledgement that in another life people would mistake for hesitation. "We will proceed how we always have," she said. He did not press. He understood what the phrase signified, the activation of plans that had been laid out in ink and in conversations where everything had been hedged and accounted for. Papers would move, filings would be set to execute on appointed terms, and boards in distant cities would be notified. No law would be evaded, nothing would be hidden. Everything she had done was lawful because it was carefully prepared. Quiet arrangements were sometimes the safest morality. Before she hung up, Immani looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. The dress she had worn to say goodbye to Celestine was folded on a chair. She slipped into a simpler dress and combed her hair, as if dressing for a meeting rather than a funeral. The midnight blue would be saved for another time. She packed Celestine's journal into a small bag and tucked the eviction notice beneath it, then took the bag and walked out. On the sidewalk, the sunlight was east and low, a thin ribbon that set the windows ablaze. She moved with a deliberateness that made the world seem to tilt slightly in response. People called to her with the practiced concern of those who perform compassion. Friends offered temporary rooms, distant relatives offered advice, and somewhere online, Tiffany's image continued to glitter like a pin on a coat. No one asked at that moment about the company whose growth chart she had once printed on letterhead and folded into a file. No one asked about the teams she had hired quietly, or the names of directors who had met in rooms without microphones. The 100,000 valuation hovered in her private ledger like an implausible halo. She did not brag about it. She did not need to. It was a scale of consequence that would require more than a social photograph to relocate. At night, she sat in a small room at the back of a hotel, the kind of place with a cheap lamp and a view of a surface-level city. She had taken the room because a change of address clarified resolve. On the bedside table, she opened the journal and smoothed a page of Celestine's ink. A particular sentence, "Patience builds power," appeared in bold as ever, an axiom that felt less like consolation and more like instruction. She wrote beneath it, in a hand she tried to keep small, a brief list. Call Robert, notify board, secure documents, board meeting. She underlined each once and folded the paper carefully. There was nothing theatrical in her preparations. The lawyer made notes, a board scheduled a call, a secretary confirmed the hour. Emails would be sent and acknowledged. She thought of the way her mother had taught her to join a hem. Fold twice, press, then stitch. There was a rhythm to how she would proceed now. Gather, set, execute. She understood that public narratives had inertia. She would have to divert that inertia with facts that had weight. She was not interested in spectacle, only in correct accounting. Before bed, she scrolled briefly through the social post that had started the rumor, not because she wanted confirmation, but because she liked to watch how images traveled. Tiffany's caption had been artful. The comments were clustered. Consolations, congratulations, a few sly jokes. No one wondered why a woman learning to name herself as a newcomer would assume the cultures of another household so quickly. No one paused at the discomfort of it. People, Immani knew, were efficient in their assumptions. The next morning the town spoke of small things. Who had attended the funeral? Which person had supplied the hymn sheet? The quality of the pie. Kwame had been photographed looking solemn. The image made its rounds with captions that arranged him as the sensible man who had borne the storm. He received the sympathy as if it were a new office, a title to wear for a season. He had begun, in private and in public, to narrate his life in a different tense. He was a man who could now be seen as the epicenter of the family story. Immani listened to the narrative with a measured patience. She let people talk. She made no grand pronouncements. She cultivated a look that asked nothing of anyone, just the courtesy of being seen as a person, not as a punchline in someone else's ascent. She reached out to a few quiet allies, a DC, a pastor who had once given Celestine a ribbon at a fundraiser, a junior director on a project she had funded years before, and asked for verified times and attention. She was the sort of person who lined up her allies like pins on a thrifted board, not for spectacle but to ensure that if a thing needed to take shape, it would have the stable supports to do so. There was an odd mercy in the way the community rearranged itself. Allies showed up to offer help that was serious in its modesty. Others offered opinions that had the weight of gossip. Gloria, in particular, wore her convictions like a shawl. She moved through the town like an adjudicator, quick to judge the visible and slow to hear the hidden. She wrote a letter asking polite questions about finances and about the future. The letter assumed that the house belonged to the man who had spoken publicly. It did not consider the possibility of an alternative truth. For her, the visible posture of provision was itself evidence. Immani answered Gloria once in a short note that closed any invitation to argument. The letter did not explain. It only stated a fact and a future. She would be present at the legal response, she wrote plainly, and she would ensure that all necessary documents were available for inspection. There was no need for rancor. There was little use in explaining the arithmetic of a life to someone who preferred drama to detail. As the days folded, Tiffany's posts grew more confident. In a video, she walked through a living room and talked about new beginnings, a phrase that fit like a ribbon around a cardboard box. The town took this as evidence. Guests at church who had never met Immani were quick to comment on the speed of change, as if grief and transition must be linear and neat. Yet the most interesting thing was not the posts themselves, but the thinness of their gaze. Images lie. Numbers do not. Immani spent the next hours in small, meticulous work. She called a director in Geneva and set a time for a conference call. She asked that certain documents be pulled, that board minutes be prepared, that counsel be on standby. She did not relish the activation of power. She treated it as one treats a well-stitched hem, necessary, functional, and tidy. Her plan was sober. She would not humiliate Quame nor set a spectacle to shame Tiffany. Her purpose was correction and restoration. She wanted the record to align with reality, and she wanted to build a proper home for herself that reflected the choices she had made. Adis came to the hotel for a late-night conversation and found Immani in a small circle of lamplight, the journal open, a legal pad covered in careful handwriting. "When do you want to do this?" Adis asked softly, because she knew her friend and did not want to push. The reply was a short, almost domestic sentence. "When the board meets," Immani said. "When counsel is ready, when the documents speak louder than their pictures." There was in that answer a plan and a patience, the same quality Celestine had taught her to cultivate. The law would be used as law, documents as documents. There would be no breathless revelations at the pier of an afternoon. There would be a measured recalibration. In the slow lantern light, Immani folded the journal shut and placed it in her bag. She rose and practiced a small private ceremony. She smoothed her dress, tucked the hem so it would not catch on anything, and buttoned her coat. The movement was as familiar as prayer. When she left the hotel the next morning, she did so with the kind of camouflage that hides intent behind ordinary things. She was not the kind of person who needed to be loud to be effective. The rooms in which she had prepared had become her private workshop. There, with counsel and board and patient documents, she would set right what had been misread in a room full of well-meaning people. She had not sought the 100,000 number as a trophy. It was the measure of the consequence of years of careful choices, the compound of patience and stewardship, taught by a mother who patched clothing and recorded small debts in a leather book. As she walked toward the car, she heard a passerby pronounce half to himself, "You have to be careful about how you read faces." Immani thought of how often faces are read quickly, an old woman's neat hands as powerless, a man's loose words as provision. She thought of how justice too can be patient and how restoration can come without spectacle. She put her hand on the door of the waiting car and let the city's small noises pass around her like a current. There were filings to order, calls to place, a board to convene, the house, the photograph, the rumor thread. All of it could be realigned when the proper records were produced and read. Before the day closed, she made another call, one that was quieter and more intimate. She called the woman who had been the steady axis of her moral education. Adis's pastor, an older woman who had known Celestine as a young seamstress and who had a way of speaking that made the ordinary seem holy. The pastor's voice on the line was warm and not surprised. "Remember," she said simply, "you are not acting out of spite but stewardship. Let your actions reflect that." Immani listened and tucked the words into the journal like a scrap of cloth that would one day be used as a patch. She had no wish to make a sermon of the coming days. She wished only that order would return to the accounts of their lives, public and private. She had, after all, been building quietly for years. If the time for revelation came, it would be because the facts demanded it, not because she thirsted for spectacle. That night, as she folded Celestine's journal closed, she did something small and private. She wrote in the margin of a page a note for herself. One word, underlined twice. Prepare. It was a domestic word and a strategic one. It bridged kitchen work and corporate governance. She placed the journal into a bag and, for the first time since her mother's funeral, allowed herself to imagine a morning that would belong to her choices alone. At dawn, before the city woke, she sat in a diner and opened a paper that listed meetings and markets in small print, her coffee cooling beside it. For a moment she let the world move without her, letting the steam from the cup remind her that heat turns matter. Then she called Robert Langley again. His voice, solid and unhurried, answered. She set the hour for the board conference and for council to be present. A sealed set of documents would be on file, he said, prepared, vetted, ready to be introduced by the proper officers at the right meeting. There was no flourish in his words, only competence. The sequence was clear: board call, filing, public notification. The pace was measured because the stakes were measured. She hung up and watched, through the diner window, a young couple argue about paint colors for an apartment. They were voices of a different kind of anxiety, public, bright, minimal. Immani folded the paper and tucked it into her bag. Outside, a small school bus hissed to a stop and children spilled out like confetti. The world continued. She did not go back to the house that day. Instead, she walked to a familiar public garden where Celestine used to sit with a thermos and hem loose scarves for new mothers. Immani placed her palm on a bench and let the memory of her mother's hands be concrete and small. When she left, she did so with the kind of resolve that does not announce itself. It is a seam stitched from one end to the other, and somewhere, in rooms with better lighting and less humidity, people prepared statements. Tiffany posted a short video thanking friends for their support. Quame rehearsed phrases that would make pity and dignity find common ground. Gloria composed herself into the role of the concerned matriarch. Each moved in stories they had chosen to wear. Immani moved in a different register. She gathered counsel. She ensured documents were where they needed to be. She lined up allies who would speak with facts rather than fervor. There would be a moment when the public narrative and the private record would meet. She had 1,000 small preparations to make before that intersection. Each was an attentive stitch. The night before the board call, she laid Celestine's journal on the bedside table and smoothed the page as if pressing a hem. Outside her window, a streetlight hummed. Beneath it, a late delivery truck idled like a patient thing. She breathed in, and for an instant, remembered her mother's laugh. Celestine had once said, while threading a needle, "The work is never finished, but it is worth doing well." Immani had kept those words the way one keeps a warm garment. Folded, never flaunted, always worn when cold came. She closed her eyes and let the memory steady her. In the morning she would speak with counsel, and the first of many small corrections to the public story would be set in motion. She would not dramatize. She would arrange. She would let the papers speak. Then, with the journal beneath her hand and the taped edge of a plan in a lawyer's drawer, Immani finally slept. The city breathed around her, small noises, the pulse of unremarkable life, and beneath it, a slow, patient power gathered itself, like the turning of fabric into dress stitch by steady stitch. Dawn arrived on the day of the board call with an ordinary indifference, pale as a pressed cloth, as if it did not yet know the work it would be asked to bear. Immani woke before the alarm and sat a long while with the journal across her knees, fingers tracing the faded ink as if by touch she might wake the sentences into action. The city beyond her window sorted itself into schedules and errands. Inside the room she folded and refolded a small list until the creases agreed with one another. Patience, she had been taught, was not the absence of time but its careful use. She moved through the morning with domestic exactness. She ate a modest breakfast that tasted of nothing dramatic, poured herself coffee into a chipped mug, and smoothed the coat she would wear as if preparing a garment for a day's work. At the hotel desk she paid the bill without conversation, and left the journal in her bag like a relic. Counsel would be waiting. The board would be on the line from Geneva. Indexed documents would sit in a clerk's drawer until the moment their authority mattered. All of it had been prepared so that fact, not fury, would be the agent of change. The conference call began on time, voices threading in from cities that held the firm's council and directors. A steady man from Geneva with inflections like tilled earth, a quiet chair who listened as though keeping a ledger, a young director whose curiosity was still clean with hope. Robert Langley, his voice plain and unadorned, spoke last and with the calm of someone used to putting stones in precise places so that bridges did not tremble. "We are prepared to enter the sealed filings," he said. "We will open them when the proper officer requests. Everything is in order." The directors' names flicked across her phone screen like small boats. She watched them answer and take notes. There was nothing petty in the exchange, no theatrical pauses, no whispered taunts, only the deliberate geometry of process. For years she had worked in that geometry. Contracts made with an eye toward permanence, board minutes that left no room for ambiguity, accounts that bore the weight of future decisions. The call finished with a concise plan. The board would meet in 2 days. Counsel would present the filings at a public event tied to a charitable evening where the company had been an underwriter for many years. The event would be a neutral stage, civil, crowded, official. It was the place where a mistake in public narrative could be corrected without the cheap satisfaction of spectacle. In the hush after the call, Immani felt the familiar steadiness settle into her limbs. She did not gloat. She had never wanted her mother's work turned into a weapon. Her aim was to restore the public record to something that matched reality. In her mind, Celestine's voice was near, calm, and practical. "Stitch well, so the garment bears the strain." She made a note in a small margin. "Remind Pastor. Invite Adis to sit near the front." She closed the journal and for one long moment held it to her chest as if it were a folded shawl. Word travels differently when it meets paper. While Immani arranged counsel and logistics, Kwame went through his own rehearsals, phrases about grief that leaned toward performance, an ease with receiving attention that had taken him years to cultivate. In the days leading up to the gala, he had begun to accept the identity others were offering him, the man whose stoicism had kept the family afloat. In a private lunch, feeling buoyed by the sympathy and the turns of conversation that fell his way like ripe fruit, he made a public comment to a well-meaning reporter. It was a throwaway line, something about starting anew and the support of someone special. And unguarded, he named Tiffany as a companion in the months ahead. The clip circulated with the speed of sympathy. On a suburban timeline and in a dozen kitchen chats it was taken as confirmation. He had a promotion in dignity and perhaps in work. He had, in the quieted eyes of his neighbors, moved forward. Tiffany, who lived in images and light, leaned into the attention like a woman who understood how to dawn on a scene. Her posts multiplied, each with a carefully curated warmth. She did not know the account books that had lain in Immani's drawers. She did not know the midnight calls to governance boards, or the careful ways in which Immani had quietly purchased the pieces of what would, over time, become an empire. The world that mistook gloss for substance had a quick tongue. It is an old habit to confuse what is loud for what is large. On the night of the gala, the hall smelled of polished wood and candles, of citrus-scented napkins, and the faint hum of a string quartet. Guests arrived in arranged color and polite faces. The city's familiar circuit of good intentions had pulled close to honor a cause. Local gardens, scholarships, a preservation fund. Immani put on the midnight blue dress she had not yet worn since the funeral. It fit as if stitched by memory. The silk caught the soft lights and held them private. She wore nothing ostentatious, a simple brooch, a pair of sensible shoes, because she had never learned the language of ornament as a substitute for evidence. She entered the hall with a composure that had been practiced in small rooms and long drives. Hadis found a seat near the aisle, and gave her the kind of look that asked no questions and gave full trust. The pastor, who had been a friend to both her and Celestine, had insisted on sitting within earshot, and when Immani caught his eye, he nodded as if to say, "This is right." She took a moment to feel the texture of the evening, the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the careful laughter that fills in the spaces between speeches. She felt no fear. She felt instead a fierce calm, like someone who has learned to press seams so they will hold. When the program moved to its formal acknowledgments, the chair invited a series of underwriters to the stage for a declaration of support. The sequence was ordinary enough. Brief remarks, a mention of the ongoing work, a thank you. People who had practiced being local celebrities made their small speeches and sat down. Then the chair, with a professional solemnity, said there was an additional matter of record to present, an administrative correction to the public acknowledgments that required transparent documentation. Robert Langley stepped forward. He carried an envelope, small and official, and the sort of expression that had seen too many things worth protecting to be showy about it. He spoke evenly. In the ordinary course of this organization's governance, there are occasions where the public record must be brought into alignment with legal ownership and stewardship. He introduced the filings with the neatness of a seamstress naming the tools on her table. "We are here to present a set of documents that clarify the corporate ownership and major benefactor relationships relating to tonight's program. There is a moment in which a room becomes a room that holds facts. It is not a thunderous moment. It is a stillness the size of a breath." Immani watched faces tilt toward Robert as he placed the envelope on a small podium and signaled for the chair to read what needed reading. It is a strange grace to have the law open its pages and let the world see what is true. The chair unfolded the papers and read aloud with the uninflected cadence of someone citing a ledger. Holdings in various entities, a majority interest reflected at certain thresholds, and a designation of lead benefactor, tied to a corporate identity, controlled by a woman present in the room. The room heard it in the way the air moved around sentences. Then, when the chair announced the valuation figure, it landed like a bell. $100 billion, 100,000. The number itself was a strange thing to say in a room built for delicate congratulations, and it made the light change on faces. Some mouths fell open in near silence. Others blinked as if waiting for punctuation. For a moment the gala was quiet enough to hear the quartet tune their instruments. The screen behind the stage, which had been set to display the organization's mission, lit itself with a single, concise slide. The company's name, its founding date, its public mission, and beneath that, in small bright type, the valuation, $100,000. Those who had assumed, those who had skimmed headlines and retold rumors, sat with the sudden, awkward work of reconciling volume with ownership. Immani did not rise to take applause. She remained in her seat like someone who had shown a seam in daylight, not to be praised but to be acknowledged. Robert, brief and precise, explained that the documents also reflected certain property interests and beneficiary relationships that had been established lawfully and transparently, a bookkeeping that matched the reality of long-term stewardship. The chair thanked counsel and, with a civility practiced in many boardrooms, invited those present to consider the record. It is worth noting here what did not happen. There were no dramatic accusations flung from the stage, no malicious unmaskings. There was no gloating. Immani had not come to the gala to make anyone small. She had come to align what the community knew with what the community would need to be able to rely upon. The public correction was a gravimetric event rather than a theatrical one. It felt like the slow writing of a crooked frame. The crowd's recalibration was not instantaneous. People pressed their lips together as if holding back comments that would feel cheap in the presence of fact. The pastor who had sat near the front stood and offered, with the simplicity of someone who knew both the dead and the living, a sentence that felt like benediction. Truth may arrive formally, but mercy is what allows us to respond rightly. It was not a sermon, It was an orientation. Those who had been quick to assume found themselves reticent. Those who had supported quietly looked to one another with the small confirmation that their gestures had not been wasted. In the days that followed, the social reverberations took a shape closer to correction than to calamity. Quame, who had earlier spoken in public of new beginnings and had allowed the world to paint him as the center of a family narrative, found his language thinning. People who had offered sympathy had to reconcile their words with the documents that said otherwise. Where he had previously been a default protagonist in local gossip, his claims now required a different kind of substantiation. There were, of course, conversations, some sharp, some sorrowful, between him and others as he tried to navigate the sudden re-anchoring of a story he had been drafting in haste. He lost neither dignity nor humanity, but he lost the convenient authority that had once been his by assumption. Tiffany's online presence retreated in the weeks that followed. Her posts, once brisk and sparkling, slowed and then stopped for a while. She had been an image at the center of a rumor. The revelation did not need to cast her as villain, only as someone who had been swept along by the current of narratives she, too, had believed. For a while she removed herself from public scenes and did what many of us do when our assumptions are proved thin. She reworked her script privately. No one, especially not Immani, publicly shamed her. The quietness of Immani's method meant that those who had been used as props were permitted to reshape themselves without spectacle. Gloria, who had measured worth by visible signs of provision, found herself in the more difficult place of having to ask questions she had never thought necessary. She, who had once summed up a person by the neatness of dress, was now confronted with the fact that tidy appearances had obscured a different arithmetic. For Gloria, the lesson was honest and private. It is poor character to never grow curious about what someone else carries behind their calm face. She wrote a letter to Immani, short, cautiously contrite, and was met with a reply that showed a woman who knew how to close a seam without rancor. A note of thanks for the clarification, and an offer to speak in person if forgiveness or explanation were sought. No theatrical absolution followed. There was instead the slow labor of relearning how to look. The legal outcomes were unembellished and formal. Where ownership and beneficiary declarations existed, they were honored as the law required. Where claims attempted to reassign what documents showed to be otherwise, counsel worked in routine ways to ensure records matched the established facts. No fraud was unearthed, no extortion was enacted. The narrative shifted away from accusation to the simple truth of demonstrated stewardship. Quame's power to cast himself as the public provider diminished not because of a public shaming, but because the ledger, patiently kept, carefully presented, spoke more convincingly than assertion alone. Immani, for her part, did not spend the following weeks in triumph. She moved with a focused calm toward remaking a home for herself that matched the life she had quietly built. She found a modest house in a quiet part of the city where morning came in soft and reliable. It was not a palace. It was a space with an attic where the light tilted just so in the early hours. Perfect, she thought, for a sewing station. She filled it with things she had chosen: a table with drawer cubbies, a lamp with a warm bulb, shelves for fabrics. On one wall she hung a framed needlepoint that Celestine had once made, the stitches tiny and exact. The journal took its place on a shelf in the kitchen where morning light would touch it first. She did not lock it away as if the pages were the source of power. She placed it openly because the lessons within had been a guide, not a secret. On the shelf next to it she placed the small silver thimble Celestine had used, polishing it occasionally as if caring for an heirloom were the same work as caring for a future. When friends came, they would see the journal and the thimble and perhaps not guess the weight of the numbers that had briefly surprised the world. They would, however, recognize the truth that steadiness and thrift have an accumulative dignity. Visits to the cemetery became once again a private liturgy. Immani would sit by Celestine's stone and read aloud something small from the journal, often the same line: "Patience builds power," not as a platitude but as a covenant renewed. She would fold flowers into neat bundles and lay them gently, the way one tends to the hem of a well-loved garment. There, in the cool shade, she would say brief words of thanks not for the valuation displayed before crowds, but for the patience that had made such steadiness possible. Her friends were careful in how they spoke about what had happened. Adis, always a companion in quiet labor, insisted on cooking a meal every week for a season, bringing dishes that smelled like home. The pastor stopped by to knit small parish tasks into appropriate charity, an invitation to a stewardship group, a lecture on ethical giving, things that made practical sense rather than moral spectacle. These gestures, small and ordinary, held a dignity Immani loved more than any public accolade. At times she found herself thinking about the strange economy of visibility, how quickly people afford credit to what they see, how slowly they cultivate curiosity about what is not immediately obvious. She remembered Celestine's fingers, stained with dye and thumb oil, and the old patient economy of small favors and recorded debts. She thought about how she had learned to separate her ledger from her household, not to hide, but to protect the long-term fruit of her labor. That protection had not sprung from fear, but from a habit taught at a mother's knees. Measure twice, stitch once. Months after the gala, the town's conversation lost the edge of novelty. New stories arrived, as they always do, carried by young voices and the quick beating heart of social exchange. In the background, work continued. Scholarships operated, gardens grew, boards met. Immani continued to attend the ceremonies she cared about, not as a way to correct past misreadings, but to invest in future steadiness. She made grants to programs that taught young women both trade and accounting. She sponsored a small apprenticeship program in tailoring, paired with business skills. In doing that, she honored Celestine in a way that fit both the seamstress's humility and the company's broader capacity, by funding the steady making of lives, not the spectacle of a single unveiling. When Kwame sent a tentative letter proposing a sit-down to speak about their past and future in a sane voice, an attempt at repair rather than at claim, she met him in a neutral room, and they spoke with the clarity of two people who had once shared a life, and who now were learning how to carry its consequences with a new honesty. They did not rehearse recriminations. They spoke of the small things that had gone unread, of the ways assumptions can build walls between people who might otherwise remain friends. The conversation was careful, and for the first time in a long time, honest. He apologized in ways that were clumsy but real. She accepted what she could and declined what she could not. There were no fireworks, no cinematic catharsis, only the sober adult labor of moving forward. Tiffany, after some months of quiet, reappeared in the town's life with a different posture. Her public career took new shapes, projects she performed with diligence rather than bravado, and she sent Immani a letter of apology that was not long, but which owned the ways in which an image had been used as evidence. Immani replied with the gentleness of someone who had long known how to unpick a wrong stitch. She acknowledged the letter and offered an invitation to volunteer with a charity program the company supported. It was not a gesture of magnanimity aimed at display. It was an attempt to convert an awkward chapter into something that could yield good use. In quiet rooms beneath morning light, Immani returned to the journals and to the small craft of measured work. She taught privately a few young women who had the raw talent and scarce resources that had once been Celestine's world. She taught them to keep records, to understand the dignity of stewardship paired with skill. She told them stories about fabric and finance, about how a seam that lasted was the product of patient repetition. Those girls learned that power accrues not only to voices loud enough to be heard, but to those disciplined enough to keep accounts. On a cool October morning, she set out to make one more small public gesture. The company, now widely recognized, still measured by its patient governance, agreed to fund a community sewing center in Celestine's neighborhood. They named the center simply and appropriately, the Celestine Stitch. At the opening, Immani stood at a podium that was bare of fanfare. She spoke in a voice that carried the old steadiness. She did not recount the spectacle of the gala or the numbers that had surprised people. Instead, she spoke of lessons learned at a mother's knee, of patience, of the dignity of labor, of the need to teach both craft and stewardship. When the crowd applauded, it felt not like the declination of a story, but like the joining of hands, a small, practical benediction. Children pressed their faces to the glass, Women with catalogued lives exchanged small pieces of advice, and in one corner a seamstress with a pair of scissors older than her hands showed a young man how to thread a needle. The scene was the sort that repairs narrative in its own quiet currency. In the evenings, when the house settled, and the light tilted eastward across the kitchen shelf, Immani would sit with the journal and a small cup of tea. She had begun, in the months since the public correction, to write modest notes of her own, reminders to call a friend, the names of young women who had shown promise, a notation about a small repair that needed doing on a donated couch. Once, on the topmost page, she wrote a single line in a hand that had steadied itself with time. Keep building. It was not a boast. It was a covenant renewed. The last scene of the story is not a triumphal procession, but a simple morning. Immani wakes to a soft light that finds the journal where it belongs, and she walks to the sewing table where a new apprentice is learning to bind a hem. The girl's hands are careful and young. Immani's are practiced and patient. They work side by side, the quiet rhythm of needle through cloth becoming a metronome for the ordinary, necessary labor of life. Above them, on the shelf, the company's files rest sealed and tidy as they always had to be. Far away, the city breathes and unfolds its many lives. When the apprentice asks, almost in passing, "How did you know to keep going?" Immani pauses only long enough to take a breath and then answers as simply as a seamstress might. "My mother taught me to make the work invisible so the thing could hold. Patience builds power." She does not demand celebration. She does not call attention to the numbers or to the moment when a room of polite people learned a different truth. She returns to her work. The world, harder to change than we sometimes hope, reads just its stories when facts are given room to land. For Immani, the repair is done not in a single declaration but in the daily stitch. If this story has touched something in you, consider sharing it. There are many quiet lives being built by hands others do not notice. Leave a note below about someone in your life who stayed steady and kept building. Give them the recognition the public often withholds. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, of patience, stewardship, and the small labors that become legacies, please subscribe and come back.